So yeah, now that we're recording, welcome to an episode of Goosey's interviews with our advisors. We have Dr. William Kramer. He's an expert on microbiology in space. Thank you so much for being with us, William.
You're very welcome. And I should correct something. I wouldn't call myself an expert on microbiology. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, and I have background in microbiology. But my real interest and expertise is environmental conditions in outer space and how those affect the search for microbial life. So I do know about microbial extraterrestrial life and the search for that. But I wouldn't call myself an expert on microbes. But
okay, thank you for the correction. Yeah, no, thank you. Would you, now that you mentioned that, would you mind just giving us sort of a rundown of how you got into the field of in consulting on space environments and microbial life, and sort of a quick background on you, so our listeners know about you and your expertise?
Sure, absolutely. By training, I was a wildlife biologist, and I worked mostly on endangered species with Smithsonian Institution for a while in D.C., and then with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also in the national office in D.C. I ended up doing a lot of field biology in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, which included all of the Pacific Basin all the way out to Yap and some of the more remote areas. And worked my way up that food chain to become a bureaucrat. Moved back to Washington, D.C., started wearing a tie, which I didn't like, and shoes, which was even more painful. And then was the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Endangered Species Recovery Program and consultation efforts out of the D.C. office. And so I did that for approximately 5 years and then retired. My wife, who's a botanist, endangered species botanist, got a transfer back to Hawaii. So we packed up, moved back to Hawaii, and were there another 17 years, where she was an administrator for U.S. Biological Survey, again with a focus on the Pacific. But when we moved back, I started doing some substitute teaching, which evolved into teaching full-time at a private high school in Honolulu, and working for the U.S. Navy. And it was during that time that I became interested in NASA's search for extraterrestrial life and the Viking missions, and started wondering about how if life was discovered, how that would be treated both legally from a quote-unquote ownership aspect, and also the bioethical issues that might be involved with that. And that sort of evolved out of my interest in endangered species. So I went back to school in 2005 and started working on a PhD at University of Hawaii. Graduated in 2012, and my dissertation was on extraterrestrial life and its patenting issues associated with that, and bioethical issues associated with that. And that was while I was working for the Navy as a consultant for about 10 years on endangered species issues, mostly whales and sonar and those kinds of things. While I was involved in all of that, I presented a paper at the, I don't want to screw up the acronym or the name, but it's National Association of Environmental Professionals in North Carolina, on the need for doing environmental analysis prior to undertaking actions, extraterrestrial actions. So, for example, if someone were going to propose to mine on the moon or Mars, that they should undergo some form of environmental impact analysis, the same way that projects are done here on Earth. It's common to do an environmental impact assessment before you start a mining operation on Earth, but there's no requirement for that or interest in that at that point, for doing that on an extraterrestrial body. So that led to me being hired by HDR Incorporated, which is a multinational architectural engineering, everything else firm that operates out of, I think, Omaha, Nebraska. And so they wanted me to look at the potential for developing environmental assessment on extraterrestrial actions as a business that HDR could get involved with, where they would actually write the environmental assessments the same way that they write environmental assessments and environmental impact statements for actions here on Earth. So I was with them for about 2 years, and but very, very part-time. It was just 10 hours a month is all that they were allowing me. So I did get to attend several NASA meetings with their environmental policy staff, one in California, one in New Orleans. So I got to meet the NASA people and appreciate their needs and their political situation. And I got a much better feel for the reality of current legislation and current policy, especially under the Trump administration. So it seemed to me that while NASA supported in spirit doing environmental analysis, from a policy standpoint, they were backing away from it because it appeared to be anti-commercial, anti-development industry. So what I'm doing now, independently, since I left HDR, is just academic research on how that might be achieved, environmental analysis, in a practical way that involved industries might actually adopt and listen to. So that's sort of what I'm doing now, both that and I'm still looking at the bioethical issues involved. So.
Well, thank you for joining us. You have had quite the career path. I know all of us at GUC are very interested in your expertise, your experience. So I guess just to start us off, could you tell us more about the importance of environmental awareness in space? Sort of why is being environmentally aware important? And what should we, humanity, consider from an environmental preservation standpoint as we venture further and more intrusively into the universe?
Right. Of course, if you look back to the last 400 years, and especially the last 150 years, starting in maybe 1840, 1850 in North America and a little bit later in South America, as all of these new resources became available within reach, there was very little consideration for the impact on the environment. So we ended up with environmental catastrophes culminating in things like the Dust Bowl, massive pollution due to a whole range of everything from heavy metals, pesticides, mine leachates, a whole range of things, burning rivers. Things are pretty much a mess. And that eventually led through a lot of public education through things like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring back in the 1960s. And then this was all evolving. This environmental consciousness in the United States was evolving at a time when I was getting out of high school, going into college at the University of Maryland, and taking a lot of environmental courses back in the late 1960s. Well, of course, the National Environmental Protection Act came along in 1970, Endangered Species Act in 1973. So I was sort of hitting the peak of that wave when I came out of undergraduate and got my bachelor's degree. So that that gave me a basic interest in understanding of the history of environmental damages. So we've addressed a lot of that, especially through, and it's been done on an international basis in most European countries, quite a few Asian countries, South American countries, North American, Canada, all now require some degree of environmental assessment prior to what we used to call, when I was working with Fish and Wildlife Service, moving dirt. In other words, projects that actually affect the environment. So I realized very quickly when I was doing my research for my PhD that there were no regulations whatsoever for that kind of approach for outer space actions. And here my focus is on the Moon and Mars, but it certainly applies throughout the solar system and beyond.
Yeah.
So often the reference was made to the Outer Space Treaty with prohibitions against forward and backward contamination. And so the focus, if any, was on protecting the Earth from back contamination for bringing samples back to Earth. And there were some regulations about transposing organisms to the Moon or Mars, but those have become more and more loosely applied over the last decade, and they're not as stringent now as they used to be, the regulations, the way they are enforced and policies that guide them. So there's definitely a need there. And I was attending a meeting, and I'm guessing here, maybe 4 years ago, here in DC, and I was talking to someone who was pretty high up in a mining corporation in Canada, and they were looking at potentials for mining on the Moon and beyond that. And they were already developing the technology, the machinery that could do that, and the specialized drill bits for exploration. And in chatting with him, I said, well, what about your environmental effects on those? And he said, well, we won't have any environmental effects. And I said, well, you're proposing to do essentially strip mining in an area maybe 100 meters by 100 meters, 2 meters deep, for exploratory. Right. And he said, well, we're not going to have any environmental effect. And he said, first of all, there's no people there. And second, we're going to push all that tailing back into the hole when we're finished, and you'll never even know we were there. Well,
oh God,
coming from essentially almost 25 years with Fish and Wildlife Service of working with private developers to try to reduce their impact on endangered species. That's exactly what I've heard for 25 years from developers. They never believe that they're going to have an effect because they don't realize the scope of what an effect is, I think. And that's a broad generality, but that sentiment was there, and the Moon and Mars, for so many, seem so remote that it's hard for them to transpose looking at environmental effects on Earth and how those might affect which they consider to be barren, desolate territories where there is, quote unquote, nothing except the resource that they're after. Mm-hmm. So breaking through that mentality is a delicate operation, because you don't want to put people off or else they don't listen anymore. But yet you want to get the message through that there are concerns. So a couple papers that I wrote started to address this. And the first paper I did, I was sort of pushing for some form of government regulation, either national or international. And I mentioned potentials for applying NEPA to extraterrestrial actions. And about, 6 months after I published that, I realized that was a mistake. It really is not, it might be a solution, but it's not a practical solution, one that would be appealing to people in development industries or government. And it was probably impractical from a regulatory standpoint. I don't think that kind of regulation would get passed any more than passing NEPA in 1950 would have passed. People aren't ready for that yet. So the second paper I wrote dropped back and looked at maybe what I thought would be good is if industries realize that it's in their best interest, financially and otherwise, to do an environmental assessment and not call it NEPA, just call it an assessment of their action and its effect. If the industries could be encouraged to get together as a group, write standards, and make them part of not a government regulatory program, but part of industrial standards, best management practices, those kinds of soft law, that might be a lot more appealing. And I think that's true, although no industry has so far said that they want to do this. So that's sort of my goal now, is to hopefully get industries together and at least get their ear, which is difficult to do. It's difficult to talk to space industries. And sell them the idea, which I believe, I think it's very true, is that it's very much in their best interest, both from a securing support of investors, because investors are not going to want to have problems pop up that they were unaware of that might be revealed in an assessment process. And also, I think most importantly, from a public relations standpoint, because there will come a time when if a company X goes to the moon or Mars and starts mining and starts making a profit, and meanwhile has piles of tailings and is polluting subsurface ice deposits or something like that, then the public is going to get interested, and there's always a faction in the public that is keeping an eye on industries and is looking at them in a negative light,
right?
Whether they're right or wrong. And so it would be in industry's best interest if they could show a history that they've documented. Well, yes, we did go and we did dig up this hectare, but we discovered there was no subsurface water or ice that could be polluted. We watched out, for hydraulic leaks and stuff like that to catch those so that they wouldn't be entering the subsurface areas. We controlled dust generation, which could be a big issue if you're exploding during a mining operation. If you're placing explosives and you're generating a dust cloud that then floats and coats someone else's solar panels or optical telescopes, there's going to be problems. Mm-hmm. So just being aware of those kinds of environmental impacts and addressing them is relatively simple, relatively cheap, and could have long-term gains. So that's my approach now.
If I could just ask a follow-up question to that. So on Earth, we've been dealing with environmental standards, environmental legislation for decades now, right? And I would say we're sort of at the peak of environmental awareness, maybe not politically, but among the population. And it's pretty clear to us, I think, what a violation of the environment looks like on Earth, right? A massive oil spill that pollutes an ocean, a large-scale deforestation, significant harm to wildlife, right? When you don't have those sort of environmental traits to measure off of, what does a violation of the environment look like on a planet where to the naked eye, it does just look like a pile of dirt? And I mean, you talked about using explosives, mining expensive areas. I mean, if that environment truly is just dirt, quote unquote, or space dust, is digging a massive crater on Mars, per se, and a violation of the environment if there's no life to be found there, or I guess that's sort of the question. whether we can identify whether there's life there or not. So what is in your mind sort of a violation of the environment? What should we, as sort of lay people, be looking at when we're watching what companies are doing on other planets?
Right. Pollution can take all different kinds of forms. If there's subsurface ice or subsurface pockets of water that might be violated in some way, that would have definite consequences for future generations and future options for development. So that would be a concern. Radioactive pollution would be another concern. Mm-hmm. From an archaeological standpoint, the example I gave from the fellow I talked to from Canada who was proposing the 100 meter by 100 meter, 2 meter deep square that was going to be excavated. If he were to do that and then replace the tailings, I agree. There's very little environmental damage, assuming that there's no pollution from that action. But if 200 years from now someone is exploring that area and finds, 100 meter by 100 meter with perfectly 90-degree angle corners, and the question will come up, how did this get here? Unless it's documented. Now, that's not an environmental impact, but there's a need for documentation of acts so that future people will know what was done in that area to make things a lot simpler for them. But also, if you're looking forward to eventual human habitation of those areas, it's always good to document and find out what happened before and how it might affect your action. If you are using explosives and you damage subsurface lava tubes, or even possible solution caves or some other kind of subterranean feature, you could be eliminating options for future use. So that would be another concern. Plus human safety, just in general. You don't want things collapsing around you. So there are a different set of standards, and this is all assuming that there's no life. If you have life there, that adds a whole nother layer of concern. I think part of environmental assessment should also include not only documenting what's being done, but exactly where it's being done, and looking for possible higher and better uses of that area. So, for example, on the moon, you have the my mind is slipping, the areas of perpetual light. What's it, points of eternal light, or whatever that phrase is. And that is very small. Those areas where light is there 90% of the time or 95% of the time. So those areas are of critical importance where you want to be collecting solar energy. And if someone went up and decided, oh, well, this is a good place to get ice, for example, mine ice or some other helium-3 or whatever it is they might find in that area, it would be very good to determine what might be the highest and best use of that area. Would it be mining? Would it be preserving it as a light source if they're going to be changing the topography? If they're going to be erecting structures that might shadow other areas? Those would all be environmental concerns that would affect options for future use. So, but the main issues, I think, would be pollution in all its various forms, and recognizing that we know so little about these areas that it's difficult to assess what their future potential might be. So what might look like just a small mound of dirt may be important for other reasons that should be considered. So I'm not saying to block construction or block progress, quote-unquote progress, but just that those kinds of issues should be part of the decision-making process the same way that an environmental assessment on Earth, or I should redefine that, an environmental assessment in the United States doesn't say that the project can't go forward. It just adds information to be put into the decision-making process, the same way that costs are. So you want to figure out how much a project is going to cost before you start construction, for obvious reasons, and the same way you want to find out what your environmental costs are before you start construction. You may be willing to pay those costs, but it should be part of the decision.
Right, and that sort of falls in the same vein as being loyal to the do not harm principle, where if we don't know enough, we don't really know what environmental actions are going to harm potentially life on that planet or the potential for future inhabitation of that planet.
Right. So that's sort of where I'm at right now on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Jessica, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, sure. I was actually wanting to follow up on that a bit because in a lot of ways, I think you're an unusually patient space professional and space enthusiast. You were just talking about how maybe we can convince companies that in the long run it's in their best interest to self-regulate, and that we should maybe take our time and try to, think in the long term and do these environmental impact assessments, and try to think about, would there be future life and things like this, and that we don't necessarily need the sense of urgency that's being peddled perhaps by commercial and political interests to an extent. And so I'm wondering what you see in the short term as things that we can perhaps do to push that longer term perspective, or else just plan for the future and try to sort of take things in the bioethical direction in the present, or at least shape the industry for the future.
Yeah, I'll start off by digressing.
Perfect.
But and again, this is a sweeping generality, but space is dominated by dominating personalities right now. The Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Bezos and others, and they would like to see something dramatic happen through their efforts in their lifetimes, and their lifetimes are running out. Elon Musk might be the baby of the group, but or maybe Bezos. But anyway, they're all beginning to see the end of their mortality is becoming evident. And I think a lot of the aggressiveness right now is because they want to see something done in their lifetime that they can say they did it. And I'm not faulting that. I don't want to sound like I'm faulting that, but it's my own psychoanalysis of this renewed push all of a sudden. And I think that's going to accelerate as these people get older, because they want to be able to see it and put their name on it. And so after saying that, how this is all going to go, I really don't know. I think that so much of it has to do with public perception. And once profits start to be made, there's going to be calls for sharing of profits with, quote unquote, all of humankind out of the Outer Space Treaty and also the Moon Agreement. Both call for degrees of that. And so that sort of links back to the Law of the Sea, which the Outer Space Treaty and Law of the Sea and Antarctic treaties all sort of grew out of similar plans and aspirations. And with the International Law of the Sea, and there are provisions for sharing of profits that come out of deep sea exploration. And that's never been done yet because there really haven't been profits made out of deep sea mineral exploration or mining. So it hasn't been tested. And in talking to a lawyer with NASA, this might have been 6-7 years ago, his particular stance on, I was asking about, how profits might get used if they're developed on the moon or at Mars. And he said that, in his opinion, nothing would be done with that until it actually becomes a law too. So if SpaceX were to start making a profit, a substantial profit off of the moon or Mars, then there might be an international case brought against them by some third party under the Outer Space Treaty, or some kind of sharing of those profits for benefit of others. And it won't be until that point, until it actually goes to court, that it'll be resolved. I don't think that will be in any way resolved before profits are made, before there's actually a problem. So, which is unfortunate. It's always better to solve a problem before it evolves than to solve it after it's become a total mess and become very political. So, where do we go from here? I'm not sure. But again, I think the key is that working with space industries and making it clear to them that it's in their interest, financial and public relations both, to address these kinds of problems early. That's best for them. The governments are backing away for the most part. Luxembourg and Belgium both have some more positive things to say about environmental protection, but unless you launch out of Luxembourg or Belgium, it doesn't really apply. So European Space Agency uses some techniques for looking at environmental impacts, but again, like with the U.S., most of their focus is on impacts to the Earth, not impacts to Mars or the Moon. Very different approach.
William, you mentioned that areas. Oh yeah, go for it.
Oh, just areas like China and India. I really don't know. They don't seem to have any interest right now that I'm aware of. Can you hold for just 1 second?
Yeah,
yeah, of course. Do you want to ask? I know. What were you planning on asking next? The international regulation or the ethical implications?
I was just going to ask about sort of international regulation. So you mentioned mostly domestic companies, sort of like SpaceX, Blue Origin, mainly companies that are U.S.-centric, mainly because we're the ones that are doing the most intrusive activities right now in space. However, moving forward, we know that other countries are also going to start performing intrusive activities in space. And right now, environmentally, the system worldwide is mainly that national governments regulate their own national companies, and there really is no international environmental regulation system. And we've seen how that's pretty much failed here on Earth. Clearly, China is producing an absurd amount of greenhouse gases that are now fueling the climate crisis. And so I would just ask,
United States.
As of the United States, yes, of course. But I would just ask, sort of, do you imagine a world in which there's sort of an international system of regulation for environmental activities in space? Do you think that's possible? I know I read about how you disagree with sort of the Antarctica treaty system and how Antarctica is treated by the world. Do you think there's sort of a better regulation system for how each individual country views its stake in space, and then more specifically how that their activity is regulated environmentally by the world?
Right. First, I'm not really against the Antarctic Treaty, but I think it shouldn't be used as a end-all model for outer space, because resource exploitation in Antarctica is highly confined, mostly to animals off the shelf. So there are very few resources that are available in Antarctica, and there are severe prohibitions for anybody doing anything up there except pretty much science or down there, depending on your point of view. So I think that the best result for outer space would be international agreements, because if right now, if one country, well, let's say if the U.S. suddenly decided to implement some rather strict environmental regulations for actions on the moon or Mars, people have the option, or corporations have the option, okay, well, we won't launch out of the U.S., we'll launch out of Mexico or some equatorial state that has very lax regulations. So it would be sort of similar to ship registration, where so many ships are registered in Liberia, not because Liberia is the shipping, know-all best place to be, but because they have the most lax regulation regarding ships that are registered there. So I think it would turn out to be a similar kind of situation, where industries would start flocking to those countries that have the most lax regulation and launch out of there. So there is a need for some kind of an international standard, and I would strongly support that. That would be ideal. But again, that's an ideal, but I think it would be very difficult to achieve just because of the nature of the United Nations if it's under their umbrella. The length of time it usually takes to get an agreement through the UN, it could be literally decades to formulate something like that. So either there will be some kind of environmental crisis on the moon or Mars where it becomes very evident that something's needed, essentially a dust bowl or some significant pollution of a large underwater area or ice area on Mars, and then that will generate the interest and outrage with a small u. There we go. That will generate public interest to the point where it's demanded by the people. So it becomes a people-driven process, the same way it was in the United States. Industries certainly wouldn't have decided on their own to implement NEPA if it hadn't been for public outrage. And that was only brought about by significant environmental damage that had already been done.
You're one of a handful, I think, of space professionals and space scientists who has written extensively about the ethical status of extraterrestrial life and what would be, acceptable versus unacceptable actions on that life in terms of its own intrinsic value per se. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little about, in your opinion, what are the ethical implications if we were to discover life in our solar system?
Okay. What really got me interested in these ethical issues was the Viking missions in the 76, 77, somewhere around in there, 1976, 1977. And their experiments with their life detection equipment, experiments they had on board, one of which was called the Labeled Release experiment, designed by Gil Levin. And essentially what it did was it scraped up a small sample of Martian surface materials and then added some nutrients, warmed it a little bit, and then looked for, it had added labeled labeled liquids, I think, radio labeled. So it was looking for metabolic products that might come out of that, gaseous products that would hold those labels, and then they could say, yes, something is metabolizing in that soil sample. And then at the end of that particular sample, the material was incinerated and dumped out, and then it was set up for another sample. So
great first contact.
Yeah, right. So I was exchanging emails with Gil Levin 8 or 9 years ago, and I asked him about if any ethical thought had been given to the fact that if they actually had found life, that our first interaction with extraterrestrial life would have been to incinerate it. And I wasn't being accusatory. I just wanted to know if they actually thought anything about ethical issues. And he said, no, we gave it no ethical thought whatsoever, because what we were looking for was very small. And that if it was very small, then it would be analogous to bacteria on Earth, and we don't have any ethical standards for bacteria on Earth, so therefore we don't have to have ethical standards for something small on another planet.
Wow.
So the issue there, of course, is, does size matter on Mars? And is that really a test anywhere for ethical consideration? And I argue that no, it isn't. That shouldn't be. And that we should proceed with an abundance of caution on how we interact with the ethics of extraterrestrial life, and admit that we really don't know. We shouldn't just go blundering in. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't search for it or look for signs of life, but that can be done remotely, and that's what we are doing now. But to purposefully kill it, if it does exist, I think sets a really bad precedent for how we go elsewhere. I have a paper that's under review right now in the journal Futures that talks a little bit about this, and they've been reviewing it now for almost 5 months. So I wish they would hurry up with their comments. But it talks about how our human ethical relationships with other species has been, that ethical concern has been growing. It always grows. The more we know about another species, the more ethical regard we give it. And I can't think of any examples except maybe pathogens, where the more we know about something, we actually give it less ethical regard. So in keeping with the journal's title, if you look out 1,000 years from now, what might be our ethical relationship with life here on Earth, and what might be our ethical relationships with extraterrestrial life should we find it. And my argument is that we definitely, with extraterrestrial life, we should not immediately compare it with Earth life, because it's different, and assuming that it's an independent origin. So if you immediately begin comparing it with Earth life and determine that you do not need to have ethical regard for it, then that changes your relationship not only with the organism, but with that environment that the organism inhabits. So especially if you begin calling things like, and I haven't heard it very much, but I heard someone once refer to any microbe we find on Mars as being a germ, which is it's a very subtle thing, but the way, of course, you term something establishes your relationship with it.
Right.
So even calling it microbial, of course, just talks about its size. All that does is talk about it, which is relative to its environment. So you have to proceed with caution. There's a film clip I use in one of my lectures at Space University from a couple years ago. I'm thinking 3 years ago. There was a National Geographic series on called Mars, and it was really good. It created a fictional story of people going off to Mars to form a small colony, and a corporation going off to Mars to do some exploratory mining and drilling. And then while they were developing that fictional story, they would jump back in the middle of these and talk to experts today about what is going on. Do you remember that? Did you either of you see that?
I didn't.
Oh, okay. I'll try to send you that clip. But in one point,
it'd be great.
They are interviewing, and I want to make sure I'm right. It was the president or executive director of, and I'm thinking it was a private group like the Planetary Society or one of these private pro-space groups. Mm-hmm. And in it, he makes the statement about the fact that it's difficult to live on Mars. He didn't say it's difficult to live on Mars. He said that Mars is out to kill you, and gave Mars personality that way. And when you say something like Mars is out to kill you, then that gives you the right to go and destroy Mars. Mm-hmm. But that's self-defense. And it's subtle, but it's something that appears in literature all the time, describing the moon and Mars as hostile, which I'm sure we've all seen. Hostile gives it intent and therefore gives you the right to go in and destroy it if it's being hostile to you, as opposed to being benign, which is what it is. So there's a lot of subtlety in those kinds of words, and leads to things like conquest of outer space, which is a colonial term. Colonizing is a colonial term that infers domination. And all of those things that seem subtle, that most people just read and don't really think about the inner meaning, they have a definite effect on how we approach exploitation of those areas. So I did a paper on that. In fact, that might have been the first paper I published. I'll send it to you. On the use of terminology, especially in the West, where we're using Western analogies from U.S. Western expansion, and using that exact same kind of language. So it's interesting. It's interesting, and that all ties in. And I find it fascinating how, and here I'm digressing again, how the use of our language in describing space then forms how we go about actually exploiting its resources, which I'm not against at all. I'm just saying it should be done with a degree of care, the same way that hopefully we do here in the U.S. and elsewhere. So.
Yeah, you're totally right. I hadn't really thought about the use of vocabulary and how that would influence our actions. One word that comes to mind for me is terraforming, which is a very like scientific, technological, futuristic term that's like, changing the environment. And terraforming sounds intrinsically like a cool and good thing, when in reality it's basically permanently changing the environment to suit human interests with potentially negative effects for the planet and its environment. That's really fascinating. I hadn't really thought about that before.
What would be a lot more exciting is to change humans so they can live in those environments.
Yeah, and then we could talk about the ethics of genetic engineering. The other side.
Yeah. That might create one or two other problems.
A few, potentially.
I think also, and this is again a digression, but the looking at multi-generational colonies especially on Mars and also on the Moon, has some amazing ethical issues, especially about next generations.
Yeah.
And opportunities for children, lack of opportunities for children that are born on Mars. And I used to be a member of the Mars Society, and then I went to 2 of their annual meetings and immediately canceled my membership because of their exuberant approach to domination. And he is absolute, and I know this is being recorded, but which is fine.
We can cut this if you want.
It's fine. He is just so obsessed with getting to Mars during his lifetime. That's a way to stoke his ego, which is mighty. So some of the things that he has written have been, I think, just embarrassing. In fact, I think I quote in one of my papers, and here I'm going to quote the quote, and so I'm going to be making it up, but it's something to the effect, what is the value of a couple of Martian microbes when we can build things on Mars like used bookstores and universities? And I'm thinking, well, frankly, I'd rather have microbes, Martian microbes, I think, used bookstore. And if you're talking bookstore on Mars, I don't think that's really going to happen, because hopefully we will have evolved beyond paper at that point. So,
yeah, that's pretty unfortunate rhetoric.
Yeah, you just...
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, thinking about weighing used bookstores versus, which we have, thousands of on Earth, versus the only example that we know of so far potentially of extraterrestrial life. It's reminding me of the question of the ethical status of life, because you talked about size being one issue, right? That people might not relate to or assign value to microbial extraterrestrial life. But I think there's also the slant that you can come at it from of scarcity. And, you've come at this, the question of extraterrestrial life in the past from an endangered species background. And I think that's such an interesting and potentially powerful approach in one sense, because even if we do find other life in our solar system, for example, from, the Mars Sample Return mission or something like that, as far as I know, we wouldn't be able to necessarily infer that life is present even all over Mars, as opposed to adapted to a relatively small environmental niche. And even if it was on Mars, it would just be one planet, and it would be so unique. And I think that that's often a powerful tool in, conservation on Earth is, save the spotted owl, it's endangered, right? Or these are the last, this is the last population of this species. And I'm wondering if you think that angle has maybe some potential to get people more excited or engaged in this issue, or how we might go about doing that.
I think so. I agree. So much is sculpted by science fiction. And informing our potential ethical relationships. And unfortunately, I love science fiction if it's good. But movies and books, in order to be interesting, have to create tension, and that's usually created by some kind of a conflict. You seldom see books about where everything is just great, because where's the fun in that? I think as far as informing the public, there needs to be more done. Kim Stanley Robinson's trilogy, Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, those 3 books are really well done, I think. Have you read those by any chance? Or?
No, but I need to, because everyone I talk to almost mentions them as a huge influence in their careers. I think Elon Musk did too, perhaps.
Yeah, that's also like the 3rd time that I've heard them mentioned.
Oh, and why I found them interesting is there's no monsters, there's no attacking aliens. It's very realistic about the kinds of problems that initial colonizers will face in terms of governance. and relationships, and trying to apply governance standards to human occupation, which is a whole nother issue. And in the books, there are, this initial team of settlers goes up, say, and they start to split and diverge in their sentiments. One group becoming more keep Mars as Mars is, and more environmentally protective, and the other becoming more exploitative of Mars resources and working towards terraforming. And so the conflict between those two groups from a political standpoint is interesting, very interesting. Mm-hmm. But again, another digression is that when like I said, at University of Hawaii, I was in this futures program, and the fellow that teaches that, who just recently retired, Jim Dator, D-A-T-O-R, the way he got started with outer space, and he was one of the founders of International Space University, too, back in the, whatever it was, early 80s, I think. But he taught a course on, he's a political scientist and was teaching political science, University of Hawaii, and as an exercise would have students design a government from scratch, how it might work. And so just at random, he thought, well, why not do it for Mars? Because that way you eliminate all of the backstory of all the different factions on Earth and cultures. So he has his students design a governance structure for a Mars colony. And he said 95% of them come back with just an absolute model of U.S. democracy, which would drive him crazy because he was looking for them to actually think beyond that. What are better? What might function better there? But he said the underlying thing is that for at least initially, it would almost have to be a military structured governance because of the tenuous nature of the danger of being there, and that initially you would need a strong authoritarian line which follows a military model. So that then presents other ethical issues, especially when you start to get children involved in looking at multi-generational. And so there would come a time when you would want to move from a military model to a more democratic model or some other model. And those would be points of conflict. So that's thinking 50, 60, 80 years, 100 years into the future, but it's always good to identify those problems early so you can be aware of them. But the Kim Stanley Robinson trilogy begins to get at that, and it's the only thing I've ever read in fiction that really addresses that in a reasonable and practical manner. So.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. Yeah, I was reading your paper on Mars, and you discussing the ability to treat Mars as a blank canvas, and one of the quotes that I pulled from that was, with the exploration of Mars and sort of the missions to Mars that are coming in the next decades, we have the opportunity to interact with non-human life without the, in your words, constraints that have framed and limited our analyses throughout our many histories. What do you think it'll take to do that? And I guess I would just ask, do you think that it's possible that we can do that in a responsible manner, seeing as we're sort of failing right now to take care of our own home planet's environment?
Yeah, it's an aspiration.
Yeah.
Whether or not that may come, what we need to do is definitely reverse the approach of Gil Levin with the Viking mission and saying, well, it's like Earth bacteria, so therefore, we can kill at will or dominate the environment to its detriment. So we need to do the opposite of that. I think we need to look for life with a great deal of deference to the potential for life that might be there, and do as much remote sensing work as possible, as opposed to going up there and doing physical operations. And if we can hold off a couple of more decades, that would be good. But that's really out of my control, or many people's control. So how that plays out is going to be very interesting. I think with the current economic situation in the U.S. and globally, with the pandemic, and then also with global climate change, space programs are going to be retarded a bit. So I think a lot of the deadlines that people initially had in mind won't be met. Those will slide a decade or so. But there's always wild cards. It would not surprise me at all, if in a year or two China launches a major effort for humans. Well, they've already said that they're going to do it. Humans to the moon within the next couple of years. So, anything can change. But and that's all ignoring the whole question of asteroids, which I don't have quite as much concern over, because I don't think that environmentally they're as complex. But then again, I'm not sure of that. Maybe the bigger asteroids have a lot more interest that way, and that's assuming that asteroids are don't have life. I don't like to talk about. I find asteroids boring.
Yeah,
you love them if you're a mineralogist or a planetologist or something, but asteroids are just big blobs floating around out there. The other issue, which we haven't talked about, which is fringy, is orbital debris. I'm not that much interested in orbital stuff around Earth. It doesn't interest me, but it's definitely a factor if we get a increasing amount of it. If we start to have collisions and then more collisions, and it sets off that the Kessler effect. I can't remember the exact term for it. Where
that's right.
Almost like a nuclear reaction where that knock out other parts and gets into a huge mess. So how that might be factored in with space exploration, I don't know. That could be another factor that would depress the rate at which other worlds are discovered.
Yeah, I wanted to go back really briefly to the issues you were talking about in terms of colonial language and space exploration and a colonial perspective, perhaps. And I'm wondering what some of the ways that we can address that might be. I mean, some people talk about diversity and inclusion and just accessibility in science, like individual scientists. And then on the other hand, there's on a more international or global scale, maybe people talk about, as other countries besides, the United States, like ESA, China, etc., as they get into the space game and are more active in that type of work, maybe this will shift or something like that. And I'm wondering what you see as the potential ways forward, perhaps, in trying to correct that narrative.
Yeah, I think, of course, right now it's the quote unquote I'll just call it the industry, which would include science and exploitative industries altogether, are European models. Even China and India are operating under European models of engineering, European models of relationships between humans and their environment. So I think in order to improve that relationship, that certainly indigenous cultures should be consulted and brought into the discussion, as well as non-Western cultures. So, or I should say other non-Western cultures. So indigenous perspectives would be extremely important, especially as far as the ethical relationship goes. And then that would also open the door, I think, to a much broader planetary-wide discussion about how to move forward, as opposed to being dominated by just those few, far less than probably 0.1% of the Earth's population that has a direct interest in pursuing outer space as a science or as the industry. So indigenous perspectives are very critical in that.
Yeah.
And on my, I think I mentioned, Jessica, I think I mentioned to you when I talked to you before that when I was putting my committee together, I invited a woman who teaches feminist theory onto my committee, and she asked me, why do you want me on your committee? And I said, because I'm male, white, an old white man. I think that's what I said. So even there, I mean, bringing in a feminist perspective is important because it's a different way of addressing some of these issues, and it certainly helps create desired outcomes, is what everybody, I think, wants.
Definitely. You've also talked about, you've talked before about how finding life beyond Earth, or even evidence of past life, perhaps, that's now extinct beyond Earth, might have the potential, if we're lucky, to provide a cautionary lesson and a new perspective on the fragility of life here on Earth. But on the other hand, you were also just talking about how maybe with all the crises that we're facing on Earth, from climate change and now the pandemic and other humanitarian crises, that those can be a distraction from doing astrobiology and space exploration, and perhaps vice versa, doing this type of exploration can be a distraction from those issues on Earth, or at least a diversion of funding, however small. And so I'm wondering how you sort of balance that cost benefit, I guess, if that makes sense, in terms of positive impacts on Earth.
Yeah, if, for example, we discovered extinct life on Mars that was would be traceable to Mars losing its atmosphere at some point, it's cautionary in that planets are not static; they don't remain the same. They're constantly in flux, even ones that are more remote and that we don't tend to think about. So, and Venus, of course, is a great example of a planet with runaway greenhouse gases that, where the temperature is totally inhospitable, at least on the surface. So those are cautionary tales, but I don't think that they're palpable to most people. In other words, Venus is hot and Mars is barren, and the moon is desolate, and but so what? I don't think that most people would make the connection between looking at Venus and knowing that it once had a much more temperate climate until its greenhouse gases built up. So, one second. Okay. I'm sharing my office with my daughter while she's working here, but that was not her.
I know the feeling.
I was just going to invite her in to go to her desk and get back to work. So now I've sort of wandered off the topic again, but they're interesting stories and parables, but I really don't see them having much effect on people's consideration of how we treat the Earth.
Mhm.
I just don't see that happening.
Yeah. Yeah. As you said, it's a it's a nice thought. We're not sure yet if it'll be realized. I wanted to ask, before we let you go, I wanted to ask one question or bring up one issue that's extremely specific. So I don't know if you'll have much to say on this, but one person that I was speaking to who's also something of an astrobiologist, we were talking about this issue of the likelihood, as far as we know, that life we'll discover in our solar system will probably be microscopic, right? And therefore, people might not be as engaged or care about it or see those impacts as being ethical issues. And one thing that she brought up was that with the rise of nanotechnology and us being at this point able to manipulate, extremely small scales to do extremely complex tasks and even to do positive tasks like medicine or environmental cleanup. And she brought that up as potentially a game changer in the long term of people, of maybe getting us to open our minds about this issue of scale, and that something being small doesn't necessarily mean that it's, simple or undeserving in some other way. So I don't know, it's just a thought. I don't know if you have any thoughts to go off of that or have encountered that anywhere else.
No, I really hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. Was that Margaret Race by any chance?
It wasn't. It was, oh gosh, I'm not positive. I don't know if I'm going to get this right. I think it was Lucienne Walkowitz. She's,
oh, okay.
She works at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, I think, and she's like half researcher,
Right.
half science communicator. She's really, really amazing.
Right. I've met her a couple of times. She's great.
Yeah.
She was she had a 1-year position at Library of Congress through NASA as an astrobiologist working at Library of Congress, I think 2 years ago. So I got to meet her. I've met her a couple of times. So.
Yeah, they're really great. I hope it was
interesting. Yeah.
It's a small universe in the space community, so to speak.
Yeah, it's one of the,
it is.
one of the great things about it.
So it's like when I first moved to Hawaii in 1980, and I was 30 years old then, and my boss, who was Hawaiian Japanese, and I was this Hawaii guy from DC, So he said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "One thing you want to remember in Hawaii is that no matter who you meet, you will meet them again. And if you screw up, people remember. And so when you screw up, which you will screw up, be sure to be humble about that. And in other words, if you screw somebody over, you're going to run into them again, and they're going to get their revenge."
Yeah.
So, so because it's a small island, that was the island culture, because you're not going to get off the island, right? So, astrobiology is the same way. You keep running into the same people over and over and over. So you don't want to make enemies.
Maybe the same in our solar system as well. It's only us and the Martians.
Right.
Can't mess it up.
Astrobiology enemies.
Right. Of course, I say nasty things about Robert Zubrin, but I doubt he'll ever meet him. So, or I've met him a couple times.
Yeah.
So I tease more than be hostile, I guess. Yeah.
The astrobiology community is also so nice, though. I mean, as far as I've encountered so far, everyone's just, for the most part, incredibly generous with their time, and it's great. So I don't know. I can't speak for other space industries or other sectors of space. But
yeah, for the most part, the space community generally. I mean, everybody that we've encountered has been so willing to dedicate their time to chatting with us, to helping out our organization. It's been really incredible.
Yeah, I agree. And well, when I first got started in this, I wrote Margaret Race at SETI, and asked her a couple of questions. And so I was literally just like 2 months into my, after I had figured out what I wanted to work on my proposal. And so she not only invited me to a meeting at SETI, which was it was small. It was like 24 people, and they were all hotshots in astrobiology. And then while I was there, she gave me this Xerox paper-sized box of books and reprints, and it was just amazing. And so she's been a good friend ever since. But I mean, just really helpful. So and that meant a lot since I was just getting started in it. So
yeah.
So yeah, it's a good bunch.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Great. She just did something. I mean, I haven't met her in person, of course, with the pandemic, but she was really, really nice when I talked to her, and did the same thing via email. Attached about 100 files into this email and said, here's the literature you want, read it. It was super helpful.
Yeah.
And of course, you've done the same. I've loved all the papers that you've sent me. So whenever you find more or write more, please keep them.
Well, it's I think I mentioned before too. There's so much new information that comes out literally daily that you can get submerged in it real fast. I mean, I get the space policy every day. They're I don't know what it's called, but it's the website. It's free. It's information, and it's bullets about what's been going on in the space industry in the last 24 hours. And so I scan that every morning. It's just endless, the information. Luckily, with the ethics and part of it, there's very little. So it's easier to keep up with. But there's still a lot. There's still a lot of stuff out there. So, and books have been written about it. So, fun. But I mean, that's what makes it so much. That's what makes it interesting.
Absolutely.
I think I had mentioned to you, Jessica, that it must be awfully dull being, having your focus Renaissance literature, where something exciting happens about every 14 years, and even then it's not that exciting. So whereas it's every day. So.
Yeah. Speaking of which, Perseverance launched yesterday. We haven't talked about that, but success.
No.
I guess this conversation might be more about whether we should have done that or something, but it was a successful launch. But again,
it's interesting that India, China, and the U.S. have all have missions now headed to Mars. So.
Yeah, I guess it's because of the alignment. So I felt really silly because I was like, what is this coincidence that all these three missions are at the same time? And I was like, oh my God, it's because of the orbital alignment.
Wow, how random. Everybody's going
how
to the
random,
same time.
I know. But hopefully they'll all be successful. But again, William, thank you so much for doing this interview, especially because I know we kind of repeated a few questions from the past and that you've written about, but hopefully we're going to try to post this on YouTube and maybe other students, other people will give it a listen. It's some really interesting discussion points here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I mean, this was a great conversation. I definitely learned some things today.
Well, don't hesitate. It doesn't have to be structured. If you want to ask a 90-second question, just pick up the phone and say, hey, what do you think about this? Because usually I'm available. I'm heading off this afternoon up to Western Maryland, up into the mountains where there's that we did find there is cell phone up there. But so I'll be out of touch for about 4 or 5 days. But other than that, it looks like I'm not going to China this year, so I'll be here. So.
Cool.
Bummer.
And I think I mentioned maybe to you, Jessica, that we were hoping to go to Western Canada in September. It's been 3 weeks up in the Canadian Rockies, but I don't think they're going to let us across the border. So.
Canada.
So that's good.
Yeah. Well, luckily, there's some beautiful nature in the United States, even if it's not as.
Oh yeah.
Definitely not as exciting.
Yeah.
As going farther.
We're real close to good hiking areas, right where we are here. So we're set.
I think Canada right now is very unhappy that they're neighbors with us.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I think it's been real fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great chatting with you again.
All right. Thank you so much, William. Always
Have
a
a great
pleasure.
vacation. I hope you enjoy the outdoors and stay disconnected for a few days.
Yeah, enjoy your time out of touch with reality.
Yeah, right. And if I find that little clip from that Mars thing, if you have not seen that show, I think it was maybe 3 hours long or 4 hours long. I think it was 4 1-hour segments. It's really worth watching. I'll send you the link to it. And it's probably on YouTube. I'll track it down. But that one clip really caught my attention because it was exactly what I was talking about in that first paper that I wrote way back in whenever it was, 2008 or something, about use of colonizing language as a way of dominating habitats. So, yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
I'd love to see it if you dig it up.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, I'll see you later then.
All right.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
vacation.
Take care now.
Thank you.